Hey Star Trek fans, Dan Gunther here. Welcome to my review of the latest episode of Star Trek Discovery, an Obol for Charon. We start this episode with the much anticipated meeting of Number One by Rebecca Romijn. I was really hoping we might get a name for the character other than Number One. The novels go with Commander Una for her name, and that would have been cool, but alas, we still just have her referred to as Number One. I do have to say in this section, Rebecca Romijn does a great job of channeling Majel Barrett's take on the Number One role from the pilot episode of the original Star Trek, but also adding a little bit of her own take to it as well. There's definitely a lot more humor, a lot more laid-back quality to this character than Majel Barrett brought to her. I have to say, I really hope that we see more of this character in Season 2. I hope this isn't it. I'd like to see her play a bigger role for sure going forward. Early in the episode, we also get a conference scene, which, Star Trek fans always love to see their conference room scenes. The Next Generation has them in spades, and the original series had some great conference room scenes as well. And it's finally great to see this crew kind of working together in the way that the crews of the past Star Trek series did. Also, Linus, the Saurian character, I wasn't really happy in the first episode with his sneeze scene. I thought it was a little over the top and kind of ridiculous, but he's really growing on me here. I really like the part that he has here. He's got a little bit more to do, actually has some dialogue that gets translated, a little bit of foreshadowing of some of the universal translator problems we're going to have later in the episode. And it's also really good to see Commander Nhan back from the Enterprise. She's joined the Discovery, and we'll see her taking Ash Tyler's place at the tactical station on the bridge. So really cool to see her here. And she's also got a new variant of the Discovery uniform with kind of a built-in skirt that we haven't seen before. So that's kind of cool. So Discovery is pulled out of warp by this strange kind of blending of organic and inorganic parts, they call it, this strange sphere that basically sends them a computer virus which causes systems to go haywire, starting with the universal translator. And I have to say, this was a really great scene with everybody speaking in different languages because the universal translator's malfunctioning and translating everything into wrong languages for anybody to understand with a piece of technology that's been a part of the Star Trek universe for such a long time. Credit to the writers for coming up with a unique and interesting problem to have with it. I was really impressed with this scene, and everyone does a really great job with the various languages they have to speak, starting with Burnham and the Klingon, and then moving on to Italian and French and all sorts of different languages, which was a really cool touch. It was a really interesting scene. Saru has been steadily getting sicker throughout the course of this episode. At first he thinks it's just a cold, but then he realizes that the end stage of his life is coming on, the Vahari. And I have to say at this point, if you have not seen the Short Treks episode, The Brightest Star, I would almost call that required viewing for this episode. It's got some really interesting backstory for Saru that plays a lot into this episode. And it talks a little bit about the Vahari, which is what Saru is going through this. Basically, the onset of this Vahari is what signals that it's time for Kelpians to be harvested by the Ba'ul, who are the predator species that presumably harvest them for food. Another happy surprise in this episode is seeing Jet Reno again. I'm really glad that her character is not just a one-off, and we see some amazing scenes of her sparring with Stamets. I really love them matching wits here, and Stamets just kind of rendered speechless when she's got comeback after comeback, and Stamets is kind of flustered by her. That kind of bickering back and forth was a lot of fun to watch. It's kind of cool to see Stamets back to a little bit of his acerbic self from Season 1, but of course they do eventually come to an understanding with everything that's going on. Interestingly, I really like the kind of interplay between Stamets seeing warp drive and dilithium and all that as kind of old school propulsion, and seeing the spore drive as kind of a new, cleaner way of traversing the galaxy, which will, of course, be interesting when it comes back to bite him in the ass when we learn later on what we learn in this episode. Getting to that, we do learn that the May Ahern blob is native to the mycelial network, and that the mycelial network actually plays as home to life forms. and they've been disrupted and possibly irreparably damaged by incursions by a hostile alien life form. And we soon learn that that hostile alien life form is in fact the Discovery and her jumps using the spore drive through the mycelial network. So yeah, interesting story here on, you know, unintended consequences of new technologies and that sort of thing. And Stamets kind of has to eat his words when it comes to talking up the spore drive as a clean technology that doesn't do harm. And of course, with this, we get kind of a concrete reason why the spore drive may be put on the shelf as an abandoned technology in the future. We all knew it had to happen. There was going to be, of course, a reason why later Star Trek shows don't have the spore drive technology. And of course, it's because it wasn't invented yet. You know, the writers hadn't come up with it. But in universe, there had to be a reason why we don't see it in chronologically later series. So it looks like that's what's being built to here. And of course, it was unfortunately inevitable, but this looks to be the beginning of the end for the spore drive. So they learn this information by communicating with May Ahern through Sylvia Tilly. And in an interesting cross between, you know, the A and the B plot, Burnham visits engineering when they come up with the idea to communicate with May Ahern. And this, of course, gives Burnham a house moment, as I call it, where, you know, a character realizes by, you know, something unrelated, the connection that's needed to solve the main problem of the plot. So Burnham realizes that the sphere is actually trying to communicate with them and says that to Saru, who realizes that his kind of going through this Vihari is almost in empathy with what the creature is going through, and realizes that the sphere is dying and wanting to transfer all of its knowledge to Discovery so as to leave a legacy and carry on somehow. Burnham and Saru do manage to convince Pike to lower the shields and accept the information from the sphere, and in doing so, they get the information downloaded and the sphere explodes and dies, using its last bit of energy to push the Discovery away and saving the ship and making sure that it's not caught up in its death. Meanwhile, back in engineering, the May life form reabsorbs Tilly, saying that she has other plans for her, which is kind of ominous, and we have that story kind of left in a cliffhanger state, which will, according to the preview, looks like it's very much followed up on next week. And we do, of course, discover that Saru is not in fact dying when Burnham goes to cut off his ganglia, which will be like the final step to putting him out of his misery and, you know, ending his suffering. The ganglia kind of wither and fall off on their own. And Saru ends up kind of returning to normal, but there's a critical difference. The fear that has dominated his life and that of his species is apparently gone, and Saru says he feels a sort of power that he's never had before. And basically discovering that the life cycle of his species is based on a lie, and the Ba'ul prey on the Kelpians through this misunderstanding and not knowing what the Vihari is all about. And he vows to kind of return to Kaminar and end the great balance that the Kelpians have used as the basis of their life. So this ensures, of course, that this storyline will definitely be revisited in the future. With regards to this story, the whole, you know, the main character is going to die. Oh no, just kidding. It's very cliched. It's something that's been done a million times before. You know, it was a little annoying here. However, it is redeemed somewhat in the fact that Saru is changed fundamentally by this experience. And of course, the insight that he gets with regards to his species, bringing, you know, some new revelation about their way of life. And in that way, I think it will fundamentally change things going forward. So I give them a little bit of a pass for falling back on the cliches here. And it did go in a direction that I was not expecting. So points for that, for sure. All in all, I enjoyed this episode much more than I did last week's. We get another bit of a return to kind of a self-contained storyline that wraps up with this episode. We get a beginning, middle, and end to a plot, that of the sphere, as well as what's happening to Saru. And even though, of course, it's going to carry forward into other episodes, this does feel like a more contained episode than we got last time. We do, of course, still have threads that continue to wend their way through this season. The obvious cliffhanger with Tilly, what's going to happen with Saru going forward, and, of course, the fact that they're chasing down Spock's shuttle. these are all threads that will continue on, but it was still nice to kind of get a semi-contained story in this episode. Highlights for sure were, like I said, the interplay between Reno and Stamets, as well as the scene where Stamets has to drill into Tilly's head, which was a little disconcerting. But, you know, kudos to the Star Trek producers for actually paying to get a Bowie song in the episode. And it was a really sweet scene, them singing Space Oddity while Stamets drilled into Tilly's head, which is somewhat less sweet, but still a really great scene and really touching. Also, the scenes between Burnham and Saru, incredibly well acted. Doug Jones, I have to say, is a real boon for Star Trek, and I would rate him right up there with the best actors who've ever been on Star Trek. It's kind of like, you know, Patrick Stewart, Doug Jones, like he's right up there, and it's an incredible get for Star Trek that we have this wonderful actor to play the role of Saru. So it looks like next week we're going to be getting Georgiou in Section 31 again. They weren't my favorite part of the season so far, but I am curious to see how her and the organization, Section 31, will fit into the events going forward. I have my own thoughts about that, but I'll save that for the theory video in a couple of days. But yeah, man, I want to know what you guys think about the episode in Obol for Charon. I personally really enjoyed it. I still think the second episode of the season is my favorite, but this was very good, and it's really helped by the acting of Doug Jones and Sonequa Martin Green also. There's this great scene where she's talking with Saru where, you know, she thinks he's going to die, and she kind of loses it and gets very emotional. And then you see her kind of like suck it back into herself and then go forward a little more stoically. And I mean, it makes perfect sense for someone who was raised by Vulcans to fall back on that training in a very obvious way. So some really good subtle acting, I think. A little bit some over-the-top acting, but very much emotional. And the group that I watched Discovery with, there was at least one person in the audience of our group who got really emotional at those scenes. I was almost surprised because, you know, he's not going to die, or at least I'm pretty sure he's not going to die, but, you know, it really got to some people, so I'm really impressed with that. But yeah, like I said, I want to hear what you guys thought of the episode. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to see your thoughts. But thank you so much to the Patreon supporters for helping out with these videos. I really do appreciate it. And thanks everyone else for liking, sharing, subscribing, and even just watching. That's the biggest thing of all. And also, like I've said in previous videos, if you know someone who might, you know, like a little bit more positive spin on Star Trek and Discovery on YouTube, show them this video. I love to get more viewers who are of a like mind and will bring positive thoughts to the conversation. So thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, live long and prosper. And it talks a little bit about the Varahi, and it talks a little bit about the Varahi, Vahari. And it talks a little bit about the basically the onset of this Vahari. Basically the onset of this Vahari. Oh man, I need a haircut. When it starts looking like Bones McCoy's, I've got a problem.